Well, it's good to have you all here again. I try to make another lame joke about having to listen to me for another week, but I think you're probably getting tired of hearing those by now and have resolved yourself to the fact that my voice is going to greet you every week, and I hope it's not too horrific an experience. I've been told, I think I mentioned before, that I sound a little bit like Jimmy Stewart, so you can sit back and at least have a warm and fuzzy feeling relative to what I'm talking about. Well, anyways, today we're going to go on to the subject of decision making, which I think is at the very central part of what we do as engineers, as project managers, as managers, period. Decision making is what it's all about. Now, the problem gets to be is that all of us would like to have some way of deciding what is the right decision. Unfortunately, the world is in such a state that defining the right decision or understanding whether a decision is right or wrong is only possible after the fact. We'll take a look at a number of different decision-making modules or different decision-making ideas and try to figure out then something about the process of decision-making. We all do it, but very rarely do we sit down and think about the implications of how we do it. And what are the biases that we bring to the decision-making process? Now, when all is said and done, as I've suggested, what it really comes down to is the essence of management is about making decisions. No matter what we do, it all comes down to making decisions. Whether we decide from an engineering standpoint to build a building out of concrete or use a steel frame, whether we should use a 2x4 or a 2x6, whether we should paint it green or blue, whether we should have a collaborative relationship or whether we should have one that's based on antagonism, whether we decide to incorporate all the facets and issues that we've discussed and will discuss in this course, or whether we choose to ignore them. These are all decisions that we make. Basically, everything we do every single day is about making decisions. There are some people who try to avoid making decisions. However, the avoidance of the decision, the choice to do nothing, is in itself a decision. So our world revolves around this issue. Our world revolves around making decisions. Yet we've really never sat down, or most of us haven't, and really thought about that process of decision making, tried to understand the context of decision making. And once again, being the people that we are, having a context makes our understanding more manageable, makes our ability to move forward more predictable. Now, the problem that we have with decision making is that it is always about what happens in the future. It's about future actions and future consequences. We don't make decisions about the past. Or at least if we do make decisions about the past, we should recognize that they don't make much difference. The event has already occurred. So what we're dealing with is something in the future. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a crystal ball. I have a hard time foreseeing what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, let alone the next day, the next week, the next month. We have economists who tend to prognosticate on the future. We have futurists who predict what the future is. Well, if we take enough people, enough monkeys, and give them typewriters, eventually we're going to have Shakespeare. We have enough people predicting the future, eventually someone is going to get it right, and all of a sudden we go, aha! We know how to do it. Well, my perspective is that as much as we would like to be able to predict the future, generally speaking, it's a quantity that is less than knowable. And that's putting it very mildly. However, the essential thing that we need to recognize is even though we can't predict the future, even though we don't know what the outcomes of our actions will be, we still have to make them. We still have to make the decision. We cannot sit there and have paralysis by analysis that if we just take one more day, we'll be able to do things better. We have to make the decision. And that causes it to be an extremely uncomfortable thing for some people, but also an extremely exciting opportunity, because we're able to go out and make a difference on something that's going to happen. And to make an impact, and to hopefully be right, and even if we're not right, then give yourself the opportunity to correct your mistake, to me, makes our business wonderfully exciting. Now, if we're going to discuss the future, it helps us to try to define some of the characteristics of that future. We may not know specifically what's going to happen, but we need to recognize that certain decisions have certain contexts that either increase or reduce the variability in that future outcome. Now, the first situation we have is one of certainty. And when I speak of certainty, I refer to that as something that's trivial. Now, it's important to recognize when I speak of trivial that I'm not saying that it's easy, but I'm saying that we can come up with an answer. If I need to look at the performance of an HVAC system, I can do a set of calculations, and given a set of assumptions about the future, I can determine what the CFM of the air handling unit should be. I can make a decision relative to a future condition given the fact that the variables are very, very limited. Unfortunately, the challenges that we have as managers very rarely fall into that situation. Maybe the challenges that we have as engineers might tend to have some degree of certainty associated with them so that we can come up with an answer. However, when we move away from the engineering perspective and move to the managerial perspective, we have two other future conditions. One of those being risk, the other being uncertainty. And the differences between them are subtle, but actually fairly significant. If we think of risk, what risk suggests is that we can identify the payoffs. That is, we'll be able to understand what the future states of nature are going to be. What are the potential outcomes? And to those outcomes, we can attach a probability. And if we attach appropriate probabilities to states of nature, we can come up with a definition of potentially everything that's going to happen, and then we can then apply mathematical models to address that situation. We then have another condition, which is uncertainty. Now, within uncertainty, we still try to predict the future. We still try to think of what might happen. However, we recognize that there are limitations to our ability to predict the future. We cannot take all those probabilities and have them sum up to one. We don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how likely something is going to happen. So as we go through these different potential future contexts, we need to have different decision-making processes to deal with them. Now, if we deal with a world of certainty, we usually are moving into the world of models. If we deal with certainty, we can take and break the future conditions down to a set of mathematical propositions that will then allow us to make a decision. If we look at it from a managerial perspective, most of these models, or the models range widely in their application and their set of assumptions, are associated with either minimizing cost, maximizing profits, maximizing revenue, something to do with financial matters. And most of these, and if we think about financial matters, they're not limited strictly to financial decisions, but also are decisions relative to marketing, operations, the whole plethora, the whole cross-section of organizational areas that encompass business. From an engineering perspective, we could think of certainty as predicting the behavior of a beam. We can understand that given certain loads, certain forces, that a certain structural member will perform within a certain range of parameters. And we can then make a decision as to the size of that member. Now, when I refer to these types of situations, I tend to refer to them as trivial. And when I talk about trivial, that is not to mean that they're easy. A number of these models, as you're well aware, are extremely complex. They take a high degree of sophistication to understand and to apply. However, they are trivial to the fact that we can take them and put them into a computer algorithm. That we don't need to have human intervention to a large degree relative to that model. And that's a very disconcerting fact, because if we deal with the world of certainty, if we deal with the world in which we're able to bring everything down to a set of algorithms, then the reality is that the computer can do it better than us. Yes, what we'll be charged with doing is coming up with better algorithms, but how many of us are going to do that? The application of that algorithm can be done by the computer. We have certainty. We'll talk a little bit later about different types of knowledge, but this is very much what we refer to as explicit knowledge, that which can be codified and written down. And that's a world of certainty. As a manager, we could only hope that our world was defined by certainty. However, as we've seen in our discussion for the previous 3 weeks, certainty is not an outcome that occurs with a great deal of frequency, especially when we deal with people, especially when we deal with other organizations, different subcontractors, different members of the project team. Certainty is something that might be desired but does not exist. So these models, while very powerful and very important to understand, really don't give that which we as managers need to make decisions. Now, as managers, we will tend to deal most frequently with a future that we perceive as risky. Okay? We will tend to use risk as a sort of a base level defining point. That is, we don't know what is going to happen in the future. Right? We don't know explicitly what's going to happen. We don't know to a degree of certainty what will happen given a certain action. However, we can identify a range of outcomes associated with that action. We can sit down and say that if we do X, then in all likelihood A, B, or C will occur. And we can assign probabilities to A, B, or C. If we feel that we have and this is one of the basic assumptions that we have in a risk environment, that we have identified all the potential outcomes. We can assign probabilities that come up to 1, which basically means that we've identified all the future possibilities. And given the fact that we've identified the sum of the future possibilities and identified their probabilities, we can go and use a model to solve that probability of a certain condition happening. And we can therefore go out and make a decision based upon that model that once again is generally focused on minimizing cost, maximizing revenue, or maximizing profits. Now the model gives us a number, and hopefully that number allows us to make a decision. Unfortunately, there is a problem with the numbers. There is a problem with assigning probabilities. When we deal with probabilities and we deal with statistics, we're making a certain set of assumptions. And statistics is predicated upon the idea of the law of large numbers. And basically what we're saying is that if we keep doing something over and over and over again, this is the most likely outcome. So when we use these models, these probabilistic models, to make decisions, we are assuming that the statistical outcome will be that which occurs the next time, because we're not concerned so much with what happens over 100 different iterations. We're concerned with what happens today. Now the problem that we have is that analysis of ours does not tell us what is going to happen the next time. The analysis is not meant and cannot predict what will happen with this specific decision. It can only predict what would happen if we made this decision over and over and over again. Now that's a fairly scary thought, because most of us feel comfortable when we get the numbers, when we think that the number tells us what we should do. We can say that the probability is X, therefore we should do Y. Well, recognize once again that that may be the best that we have, but it does not tell us what is going to happen at this specific point in time for this specific decision variable. And unfortunately, we tend to delude ourselves. We tend to put ourselves in a position where we act as if this is what's going to happen. Statistics talks about probabilities. It does not talk about certainty. So by definition, we are in a state where we don't know exactly what's going to occur. Even more so as we look at this issue, moving away from the statistical limitations of risk analysis, is the reality that within these conditions, the probabilities, as much as we may think we can define the future, it's hard for us to know everything. And as much as we might think that we can identify the probabilities of the outcomes, the reality is that given the fact that what we're dealing with are events that have not occurred, there is going to be a margin of error. We are making assumptions about the future. And when we assume, I think everyone knows the classic statement about what that does to you and me. But again, as managers, where we add value here is to recognize what those future possibilities are, to be able to look into the future and understand what might happen, and to start understanding what the probabilities of those events are. There is no book that we use to look up the potential future conditions. There is no book that we can look up that will tell us the probability of these future conditions occurring. What we're talking about here is making decisions that will impact the validity of the model. The model may be mathematically correct. It may be statistically appropriate, but it's predicated upon a certain set of assumptions about the future. And the model is only going to be as good as those set of assumptions. So we have two issues with risk. One is the fact that we are predicting a future that we don't really know. And two is the fact that we are making a decision using a risk model that does not predict what is explicitly going to happen the next time. Sounds like a rather disconcerting world to live in, doesn't it? Now we come to a condition that, to my way of thinking, really defines the most common future state of nature. That is the idea of uncertainty. Here we have an idea of what the outcomes can be. Obviously, we have some idea of what the impact of our decision would be. Otherwise, we would never be able to start to make it. But we don't know what the probabilities are. And when we admit that we don't know what the probabilities are, that means that we can't sum to 1, and that means we cannot, by definition, identify all the future states of nature. We are not positive of all the outcomes that might occur, and those that we are positive that might occur, we cannot say with an appropriate degree of certainty how likely they are to occur. Now this, in reality, is a state that most of us find ourselves in most of the time. This is the point where managers really earn their money. This is the point of time where we are not able to take things and define them in terms of a mathematical model and hope that that model guides our decision making. This is where we have to recognize that we're dealing in a world of constant change. My experience suggests that very frequently this is the world that we find ourselves in projects. This is the world that we find ourselves in construction. This is the world that we find ourselves in when we deal with these immensely complex projects. And one of the biggest problems that we have is that we don't admit it. That we don't admit that this is the future state that we're going to be dealing with. But here's your opportunity to earn your money. Here's your opportunity to really make a difference as a manager. And quite frankly, here's your opportunity to fall on your face. Because if you deal with this type of world, the odds are that you are not going to always make the decision that's appropriate. The odds are that you are going to fail sometimes. Which suggests one of the other most important things about decision-making processes is that we have to allow ourselves the opportunity to change them. Quite frankly, staying the course in the face of evidence that we screwed up is a surefire recipe for disaster. As we learn more and more about the future, we're able to make better and better decisions, and we're able to judge the validity of the decisions that we've previously made. And we have to accept the limitations of those decisions, which then allows us to make new decisions that reflect our increasing knowledge of what that future is as it becomes the present. Waxing a little philosophical there. Now, when we deal with uncertainty, what does a manager do? Well, quite frankly, most managers take the easy way out and they lie to themselves. They say, no, this world is not uncertain. What we're dealing with is a world of risk. We will take a condition of uncertainty and pretend that we can assign outcomes and probabilities. And unfortunately, we see this very, very frequently. We see this extremely frequently in the world of project management due to our engineering orientation, due to the fact that we feel much more comfortable dealing with a set of numbers. To deal with the unknown is tough. And the problem is we can't even add a factor of safety of 10 to make sure we do the right thing, because we don't know what's going to happen. So given the fact that we recognize that maybe lying to ourselves is not the best vehicle to make a decision, we still need to go and make that decision. And here we find that the personal characteristics of the decision maker become incredibly important and become the dominant factor in deciding what will be done. And we can break this down into basically two different components. The first is what we refer to as the individual who has a maxi-max orientation. This is the person who sees the glass as half full. They will take and make the decision that maximizes the potential for the maximum benefit to occur. We assume that the future is going to be positive. Therefore, we will make decisions that allow us to capitalize on that positive outcome. Is it legitimate? I don't know. By definition, we're dealing with a world of uncertainty. But what we're seeing here is that the personal characteristics, the personal belief systems, whether the person is an optimist, a pessimist, or we might say a realist, comes into play here. On the other hand, we have those that we refer to as using a maxi-min strategy. That means that we want to minimize the potential for the maximum bad to happen. That we look at the world as having the potential to have the worst case occur, and we want to minimize the opportunity that the worst will occur. Our world, are we a pessimist? Are we a realist? I'm not sure. But I think we could probably all identify people, right, who see the future as a series of failures and therefore either make decisions or try to avoid making decisions predicated upon that. We see people who are endlessly optimistic about what's going to happen, and they will make decisions predicated upon that. What I suggest that as a manager you need to do is, when you are dealing with uncertainty, recognize the underlying philosophical view of the future that you're working with, and then make your decision. Just recognize the basis from which you are coming. That will then allow you to be more effective in modifying that decision as you go forward. That will allow you to see and understand the set of assumptions that you make going forward. Because when we deal with uncertainty, those assumptions become clouded. They become embedded in our personalities, in our views of the world, as opposed to any explicit list of issues or ideas or contexts that we put forward. So understanding ourselves in this situation is the key. Now, we've been talking about future states of nature and trying to boil down and understand our decision-making criteria. To add an additional layer of difficulty to this is the fact that most of the previous decision-making models assume that we can reduce the future to a set of numbers. And I would suggest that the reality is that most decisions are much more complex than that. That when we start to reduce everything to a number, we start to eliminate and lose the richness and the variability that we really need to bring into our decision-making process. And if we can't reduce everything to numbers, the techniques that we talked about previously become ineffective. We also generally assume that we can reduce these criteria to a single item, whether it be minimizing cost, maximizing revenue, maximizing profit, whatever it be, that we have one item that we can hang our hats on. Well, maybe in the world of things we do want to maximize profit or revenue or minimize cost. However, when we look at the specificity of a specific decision, it does not translate cleanly to that issue. That everything we do is generally going to affect multiple items. That there are going to be multiple impacts of any decision. That organizations don't exist in isolation, that functions within that organization don't exist in isolation. If I make a decision in accounting, it will affect marketing, it will affect finance, and so on and so forth. That every decision that we make will generally have multiple outcomes. Some of which may be quantitative and we can apply numbers to, others which may be qualitative. We have a situation where we have apples and oranges. And we try to make a decision of how many apples 3 oranges are worth. And what that worth is embedded in me as an individual. Now, as you go forward with your assignments this week, you're going to be dealing with the even swaps methodology. I'm not going to discuss it at length. You have an article there that lays the process out. But the even swaps methodology I find to be an extremely powerful and intuitively attractive way of making decisions, because it does not assume certainty about the future. But what it does do is require you as an individual to be explicit about your decision criteria. That very often as we try to quantify things, we bring things down and we make assumptions about what X is worth versus Y is worth, but we don't have that explicitly stated. In the even swaps, we explicitly identify what our trade-off is. How many apples is an orange worth? And as I said before, the decision is predicated upon our personal choice. And given the fact that it's predicated upon our personal choice, there may be, in fact there will be, more than one right answer depending upon who is guiding the decision-making process. And notice I say that there may be more than one right answer. I'm not saying one answer is right, one answer is wrong, because we only know that in hindsight. We only know if we were right or wrong after the fact. And unfortunately, we can't wait till after the fact to make the decision. We have to make them now. So right now, today, 2 decisions that are different may be both correct given the set of assumptions, given the set of trade-offs that occur. What's powerful about the even swaps methodology is it forces you to explicitly identify those trade-offs. It forces you to explicitly identify what is important to you. It forces you to explicitly rank different things. Now, are your trade-offs correct? Are your rankings correct? I make no judgment about that. We'll only know tomorrow after we see the impact of your decision. However, at least with this, we can identify why we made the decision that we did. We can identify the process of making decisions. Because in reality, given the fact that we don't know the future, The only thing that we can really hang our hats on is the process. Is the way that we made the decision appropriate? Did we follow some logical and defendable process in making the decision? Or was it ad hoc? Now, the ad hoc decision may in the end be the right decision. Unfortunately, I don't know that. And I think we would all agree that we are much better off at least understanding why we make the decision than just sort of going from the seat of our pants. So with these complex decisions that we really are going to be dealing with, this even swaps methodology, I think, is a very, very powerful tool. Now, I think previously we've introduced the idea of bounded rationality to our discussion. However, if I haven't, let me do it one more time, because I think, as I probably previously said, this is one of the most important insights that you can have about yourself and other people as managers. Herbert Simon, my favorite Nobel laureate economist, developed this concept. And when I first read it, it bowled me over, because it really captured the essence of that which we struggle with internally as managers making decisions. And bounded rationality basically says that to a greater or lesser degree, we're all stupid. Now, let's not take that as an insult, but let's take that as a recognition of the human condition. Our previous discussions of organizational behavior, we were never able to clarify or to define with a degree of precision what people would do. By the same token, as we deal with other decisions, we recognize that we have a limited computational ability, that we are not infinitely capable computational machines. We can only factor in so many variables. We can only deal with so many numbers. We can only deal with so many future states of nature. As human beings, we can only deal with so much data at any given point in time. In addition to the fact that we don't have data, we've all admitted, or at least I hope we have admitted, and if I'm wrong on this, if I'm incorrect and you do have a crystal ball, please contact me. I'd like to, take advantage of your insight. But we don't have crystal balls. We don't know what the future is going to hold. So, we're all stupid. We don't know what the future is going to hold. Therefore, what's going to happen with our decision-making process? We will make mistakes. Now, that is a horrific concept for many people to try to deal with. The recognition that we will make mistakes. I would argue to you that the only person who doesn't make a mistake is that person who doesn't make a decision. And I'm not even suggesting that that's the person who avoids making a decision or leaves the status quo as it is, because doing that, you can come up with a mistake. What I'm suggesting is the only person who doesn't make mistakes, who is someone who takes themselves out of the decision-making process entirely. If you make decisions, you will goof up. It is part of what happens. It's the one certainty that you have in the decision-making process, is that you will make mistakes. This one degree of certainty, then, really suggests an important insight as to a factor that needs to be included in any decision-making that we have. If we agree that we are fallible, if we understand that we're going to make mistakes, then we need to include flexibility and the option to change in our decision-making calculus. That somehow our decision has to give us the ability to move to a different criteria, a different decision in the future if we find out that our assumptions were wrong, that our decisions were wrong, that our probabilities were wrong, that our trade-offs were wrong. As we learn more and more about the future, as we go on in time, the future becomes the present, and we now know what's happening, and we can compare what we thought was going to happen to what actually happens. And if there's a match, maybe we can continue. If there's a disconnect, if our assumptions about that future are not what we're experiencing now, in all likelihood, we need to change the decision. To carry on simply because we made the decision is not a prescription of strength. It's not a prescription for managerial competency. It's a prescription for failure. We need to factor all the new information that we get at any point in time into our calculus. We have to keep updating our decision-making process. We can't see the future. We're all stupid. We're going to make mistakes. Therefore, some degree of flexibility, some ability to change, some ability to recognize who we are and the environment in which we are going to be working is absolutely critical to our success as decision makers. Given all the pitfalls that I've described in the process of decision making, I may have developed or seem to be encouraging a situation where you should avoid making decisions. Well, that's not at all what I was trying to encourage. What I'm trying to suggest is that we need to recognize the reality of that decision-making process. We need to recognize the reality of the world in which we exist. We need to recognize the fallibility of our own processes and our own decisions. And all of this was summed up succinctly for me one time by one of my students, a Sergeant Simmons, a Marine Corps sergeant here at Norwich. And he presented to me 3 principles of decision making which really embody the essence of decision making as it relates to managers. The first is that no plan lasts longer than the firing of the first bullet. Let us recognize the fallibility, whichever, of our decision making. Let us recognize those things that are incorporated in the reality of our inability to know the future and the reality of our own bounded rationality. The plan will have issues. It will not perfectly predict what will happen in the future. Given the fact that we can't predict the future, given the fact that we are boundedly rational, semper gumby, that is always flexible. Flexibility is a positive value. It's interesting, in the presidential debate, we hear this discussion, this argument of flip-flopping. You know, to me, flip-flopping is not the issue. Changing as you develop and understand the world better is the issue. We need to react to that. Once again, just because we made the plan doesn't mean the plan is right. We need to hold the plan up to the reality of today. And does it still pass the test of time? Or do we need to change? We need to embody the ability to change in our decision-making process, in our actual decisions. Lastly, Even though we know the plan's going to be wrong, even though we know we have to be flexible, indecision kills. We still have to make the decision. We still have to go forward. We still have to decide what we're going to do. It's a challenge. It is an immense challenge. And it is the essence of what being a manager is.